Hi there guys, got a video here for you today on the AGT Vixen, and what I'm going to be doing in today's video is fully stripping the rifle down as well as giving you some servicing tips as I walk through the procedure. Now before I begin on the video, I do very briefly want to mention that if you need any O-rings for your AGT Vixen, a full list of O-rings can be found in the back of the manual, and I'll put a picture on screen now just so you can see what the O-rings are. So if you're looking for O-rings for your AGT Vixen, these sizes are in the back of the manual. With that said, the first thing we're going to be doing is making sure that the rifle is safe to work on by first cocking the rifle, and then removing our single shot loader or magazine if one has been fitted. This one here is the single shot loader from 3D Printed Concepts and is just a seller on eBay. With that said, the next thing we're going to do is close the bolt, then fire the rifle into a nice safe backstop. What this does is make sure there's not a pellet loaded into the barrel and that the rifle is safe to work on. The next thing we're going to be doing is fully degassing the rifle, and on this rifle that's nice and easy to do as there is a bleed screw in the back here. You can loosen that using a 2mm Allen key, and that's just that bleed screw there. You should only need to do it a turn or two, and the rifle should start leaking air from this area here. Simply leave the rifle to fully degas, and then once both the gauge, so this gauge here, reaches 0, and when you dry fire the rifle, no air comes out the end of the barrel, you're safe to proceed. With that done, the next thing I'm going to do is make the rifle a little easier to manipulate for the camera. So what we're going to be doing is removing the bottle and buttstock, as well as the shroud, barrel, and then this bottom guard here. Starting off with the bottle and buttstock, the first thing we're going to do is loosen this bolt here using a 3mm Allen key. And that will allow us to slide the buttstock off. We can then slide the neoprene cover off, and with the rifle fully degassed, we should be able to loosen the bottle. They are done up fairly tight from the factory, so just keep a nice firm grip of the action, and if you need to, you can always wear some neoprene or nitrile gloves. And I have seen quite a few people use the airsoft adapters, so you can get new butt pieces and stuff like that, which just slide over the original bottle. Next thing we're going to be doing is removing this bottom rail here, and that's done by loosening these two screws in the bottom using a 2.5mm Allen key. These will be done up fairly tight from the factory, so just be aware of that. And with those two screws loosened, you can just remove them, and then remove the Picatinny rail and the shroud guard. Now this one here has been replaced, so this is the metal guard. The standard rifle comes with a plastic one from the factory, and if you wanted to swap these two pieces out, you would simply need to loosen these 3 bolts here, put the new metal one on, then reinstall the 3 bolts. But there we have it. We'll put that over to one side. Then we can move on to the shroud and barrel. The shroud is just screwed onto the end of the barrel, so we can just unscrew that. And then if we wanted to, we could also fully disassemble the shroud. To get the ends off, you will need a set of dowel pins. So on this end, you would simply use 2 3mm dowel pins, then something like a screwdriver across the dowel pins to crack the end loose. That's already been done on this rifle, just to save us a little bit of time. And there we have the end. So this is the part that screws onto the end of the barrel, and this is just the baffle chamber. It is all aluminium, so it's nicely well made, and it does have 2 O-rings round it, one at the front, one at the back. These aren't sealing O-rings, they're just to insulate the metal baffles from the metal shroud. We can do the same on the rear piece, this piece here, and on this piece you just simply need to use 2 2mm dowel pins. Again, this piece does have 2 O-rings, one around the base of the threads here, and then the other just in this hole here. This inner O-ring here seals around the barrel and stops gas from escaping back through the shroud and into your face when you're shooting the rifle. It also helps to stop the end cap from rattling on the barrel. But we'll put those over to one side and then remove the barrel. So the barrel is held in by two grub screws, one in either of these two holes here, and we're going to be loosening those with a 3mm Allen key. These don't need to be removed fully. We can just loosen them a few turns and then gently pull the barrel out from the block. The barrel on this particular rifle is a 177 250mm long barrel, and this one is unchoked. I will mention at this point that we have an O-ring in the end of the barrel here. This is our breech seal, and this seals around the brass pellet probe. If this O-ring has failed, you'll have a leak of air emanating from the breech area every time you take a shot. So it's not a permanent seal. The O-ring only sees pressure when the rifle is fired. Another symptom of this O-ring failing is that the rifle may be low on power, so if your rifle's low on power, it's worth checking that O-ring. The last thing I'll do before we start getting into the proper disassembly is just remove the grip. That's done by removing this bottom piece here from the grip, and you do that by just pinching the two sides and pulling it out from the bottom. We can then locate the grip bolt in the base there and remove that using a 5mm Allen key. With that done, we'll start work on this rear section here. So the first thing we're going to do is remove it from the rear of the block. And to do that, I'm just going to be using a 3mm Allen key to remove these three bolts here. As we separate the two blocks, just make sure that this O-ring in this part here doesn't get lost, as it can come loose as you separate the two components. And for now, I'll be sticking the main block over to one side and concentrating on this piece here. To start with, we'll tip out the bolts, put those over to one side, and then we're going to be removing the regulator by pushing it out from this side. So through the block, just like that. To do that, I'm just going to be using a plastic O-ring pick with the tip broken off. Pushing that out from the block nice and gently. It is a bit stiff in the block, so just give it a little push and it should come out from the back. We'll fully disassemble the regulator very shortly. For now though, we'll finish off this block here. So the next thing we'll remove is the gauge. So this gauge here just has one of my gauge covers on it. And then we're going to be removing the gauge just by using an adjustable spanner. Beneath the gauge we do also have a one-way valve in the base there, so I'll get that out as well. And to get that out, we're going to be using a T10 Torx bit. So there we have our one-way valve, which is just that piece there. Right then, so with that done, we've got a few O-rings exposed now, so I just thought I'd run through very briefly what happens when each of them fail. So to start off with, we have our gauge O-ring, this one here. If this one here has failed, you'll have a constant leak of air emanating between the joint of the gauge and this block here. We also have the one-way valve, which is this piece here. This has an O-ring on the base of it, and if this O-ring has failed, you'll have a constant leak of air emanating from the fill port, so this hole on the side of the rifle. Moving on from that, we do also have a face seal here, so if this O-ring here has failed, you'll have a constant leak of air coming between the joint of the bottle and the joint of this rear block here. Moving on to the regulator, this piece down here, we have three O-rings on the outside. So these two here, so the one at the front, then this first one here. If either of these two O-rings here have failed, you'll have a small and constant leak of air coming through the regulator bleed hole. So this hole in the bottom of the block. We also have another one in the back of the block here, so this O-ring here, and if this one has failed, you'll have a leak of air emanating between the joint of these two components. the final O-ring on the regulator, so this one at the back here will leak in the same place. So this O-ring here stops reg pressure from escaping and coming out of the joint of these two blocks here. With that said, we'll get all this put over to one side and we'll start disassembling the regulator. Right then, moving on to the regulator. So the first thing I will mention is that I have gone ahead and put the regulator in my reg tester, and this regulator is currently set to around 110 bar. Now I will mention that my rifle is the 177 Vixen Compact in sub 12 pound power level, so if you have a different rifle, your regulator pressure may be slightly different. If you don't have a regulator tester for your rifle, what you will need to do is use a set of calipers and take a measurement from this front face of the adjuster screw to this back face of the regulator. On this particular rifle, it's around 61 millimeters, and that on this rifle is set to 110 bar. Taking this measurement will allow us to reset the regulator when we come to rebuild it, and if we get the measurement correct, the regulator set pressure should be roughly the same. Now, I will mention at this point that on this particular regulator, the adjuster screw is proud of the locking nut. If your adjuster screw isn't proud, so it's slightly beneath the locking nut, you will instead need to take a measurement between the locking nut face and the adjuster screw face. So just be aware of that. With that all said and done, we can start on the disassembly process, and the first thing we're going to do is take a 17mm spanner and a 10mm spanner and use that to crack the locking nut loose. And then we can use a 4mm Allen key just to remove the adjuster screw. There we have it there. With that done, we can turn our attention to the other side of the regulator, and again we're going to be using a 17mm spanner across the flats on the body, and then we can use a 4mm Allen key to remove this cover plate from the bottom. This does have a tight fitting O-ring around the base, so it will not come out of its own accord. What you need to do is use a M4 bolt, screw that lightly into the base of the piece there, and then wiggle it loose. The back cap is fairly tight within the regulator body, so you will need to give it a fair tug to get it out. And if you're unsure on what a M4 bolt is, you can just use one of the three that's used to hold the back housing onto the main block. So just one of these bolts here. But with that removed, we can use the same M4 bolt to remove the regulator piston from the base of the regulator body. Be nice and careful as you pull this out, as there will be a number of Belleville washers on the regulator piston. So there we have our piston there, as well as our regulator body. Right, with that all said and done, we have a few new O-rings exposed now, so I'll just go through their leak spots. Starting off with the rear of the regulator, this one here on this back cap. If this one has failed, you'll have a constant leak of air emanating from this joint between this rear section of block and the main block. Moving on to the regulator piston, we have two O-rings, one at the top, one at the bottom. If either of these two O-rings have failed, you'll have a constant leak of air emanating from this hole in the bottom of this rear block here. Next up, we have this O-ring on the end of the adjuster screw. If this O-ring has failed, air will be able to bypass through the regulator, so from the high pressure bottle side into the lower pressure regulated side without any resistance. In other words, if this O-ring has failed, regulator pressure will equalize with bottle pressure. The last seal within the regulator is a mechanical seal between the top of the regulator piston and the bottom of the regulator adjuster screw, so between this face here and this face here. These two components seal against one another when the rifle is ready to take a shot. If you have a poor seal between these two components here, what you'll get is excessive amounts of regulator creep. Regulator creep can be defined as any increase in pressure after the regulator has reached its set pressure. So in other words, if we were to set our regulator at 100 bar and then check the rifle after 15 minutes, if it has risen to 110 bar, that's 10 bar of regulator creep. Another way to tell if your regulator is creeping is if you have a high or low shot the first time you shoot the rifle after setting it down for 10 or so minutes. That's not always the case, as sometimes other factors can influence the first shot from the rifle after it's been standing for a little while, but it is a good indicator on the status of this seal here. With that all said, that's done for the regulator. We'll put this over to one side and bring over the main block. Right then, moving on to the main block, the first thing we're going to do is finish out on the pressurized side of the rifle, and we're going to do that by removing the valve. So the valve on this rifle is located in the front, and it's covered over by this cover here. This cover can be removed by loosening and removing the 4 securing screws using a 2.5mm Allen key. As you remove the last bolt, just be aware that valve return spring pressure will want to force this cap off, so just make sure that doesn't ping off as you loosen the 4 screws. With that removed, we can remove the valve from the middle by just gently pulling on the spring. And here we have our firing valve. And we do also have an O-ring in the front of the block. So this O-ring here. If this O-ring has failed, you'll just have air leaking out between the joint of this front piece here and the block itself. We also have the valve seat, which is that shiny piece in the base there, and that and our firing valve seal together to create an airtight seal. If the seal between the valve and the block is bad, you'll have a constant leak of air emanating from the end of the barrel. I'll talk more about that when we come to rebuild the rifle, but for now we'll get the valve components set off to one side. Right then, with that all said and done, that's pretty much it for the pressurized side of the rifle. The next thing we're going to be doing is taking the mechanical action apart. So to start off with, we're going to be removing the scope rail, and that's done by loosening these 3 bolts in the top using a 3mm Allen key. So that's the top rail removed. I will just mention that all 3 bolts are exactly the same length, so you don't have to worry about mixing them up. Next up, we're going to be removing the cocking arm. So to begin with, we're going to be taking a 1.5mm Allen key and loosening this locking screw on the bottom of the block. Just loosening that lightly, we don't need to remove it fully. Then we can take a 2mm Allen key and unscrew this pivot bolt here. Now as you remove this, be nice and careful, as there are 2 very thin washers, one on the top and one on the bottom of the cocking arm itself. So we'll remove the pivot joint, so that's just the pin there. Then before we remove the arm, we are just going to loosen this screw in the side of the pellet probe using a T15 Torx bit. With that done, we can just lightly lift out the arm, then pull it out, being nice and careful not to lose either of the washers. So on this particular arm, they both stayed within the block. So there we have the bottom one, and there we have the top one. With that done, the next thing we'll do is remove the cover plate on this side, and that's done by removing these 2 screws here using a 2.5mm Allen key. And there we have it. We can't remove the pellet probe just yet, as it still does have the cocking dog on it, so we're just going to be leaving that within the block for now. The next thing we'll do is remove the trigger, and that's first done by removing the cover by removing these two screws here using a 2mm Allen key. As you remove that, I just will make you aware that the front screw is the short one and the rear screw is the long one. So long, short. Up next, we'll remove the trigger cassette by loosening these two screws here using a T10 Torx bit. And there we have the trigger cassette. Now, I won't be taking this fully apart in this video. However, in the near future, I am planning on making a metal trigger for the rifle, so I'll take it apart in that video. With the trigger removed from the bottom, the next thing we're going to be removing is the hammer and hammer spring assembly. To start off with, we're going to be loosening the adjuster screw lock, which is this piece here, using a 1.5mm Allen key. And then we can loosen this piece here using a 4mm Allen key. Right then, so there we have our hammer spring adjuster, our hammer spring along with the anti-rattle guide, this plastic piece here, and then finally we have our hammer, so just this piece here. With the hammer removed, we should just be able to slide the pellet probe out from the back of the block, nice and carefully, just like so. At this point, I will mention that there is a spring and a ball in the top of the pellet probe there, and that's just for the lock back detent. And we do also have the cocking dog, which is this piece here. So that is what pulls the hammer back, and then it locks into position against the trigger sear. But there we have it. I'll put that over to one side. Right then, with that all said and done, that's pretty much the entire block fully disassembled. There are still one or two more things we could remove if we really wanted to. So starting off within the block, we have this large spring here. So this spring's job is just to remove the flop from the cocking arm as the rifle is fired. So it puts a little bit of tension on the pellet probe and stops it from flapping around as the rifle is shot. But that's just in that hole there. Next up we have the safety. The safety is held captive by a small spring and ball, just where these ridges are here. So just in there, you can just about see the ball detent, and if I actuate the safety, you can see that jumping up and down. If you wanted to remove the safety, you'd simply need to depress that ball bearing and then push the safety out through the side. However, I'm going to be leaving mine where it is. Next up, we have the magazine detent, this piece here. If you wanted to remove that, you would need to push the plunger down and use a 4mm Allen key to unscrew the cap, which is just this brass piece here. Now, they are done up fairly tight from the factory, and I'm going to be leaving mine where it is, but I just wanted to mention that. The very last thing on the block is the transfer port cover, so this cover here. On the sub 12 pound rifles, or on some of them, there will be sort of an anti-tamper glue poured in the hex hole. However, that's not present on the FAC rifles, and it wasn't present from the factory on this particular rifle. And I will mention on the back of this cap, it does have an O-ring. This O-ring is not a constant pressure O-ring, it only sees pressure when the rifle is fired. And if this O-ring has failed, you have a puff of air emanating from this area here every time the rifle is shot. On the sub 12 pound rifles, there will also be a transfer port restrictor in this hole here. It's just a piece of brass to take up some of the transfer port area. The restrictor itself can be removed fairly simply by just screwing an M3 bolt into the side of the restrictor. Then we can pull it out. So there it is there. On the FAC rifles, this won't be fitted, but as this is a sub 12 pound rifle, it has been fitted to this particular rifle. But with that all said and done, that's pretty much it for the disassembly of the AGT Vixen. In the next video, I'll be taking the rifle components and reassembling them into a functioning rifle. Before I do that though, there are a few measurements that I want to take, so that video will be coming in the next couple of weeks. But for now guys, thank you very much for watching. I hope this has been interesting or useful. So thanks for watching, I'll see you in the next one.